A very big welcome to everyone and good morning. Welcome to Doing Sustainable Pedagogies in Early Childhood Education. This is the first in a series of 3 sessions. And I would like to begin by expressing my thanks to the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center and for their support in this series. My name is Iris Berger. I am a faculty member with the Faculty of Education at UBC, and my responsibilities include teaching in early childhood education, as well as organizing events such as this one. Before we begin our session today, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I'm situated today. My home is in a place that is now commonly referred to as Vancouver, but I would like to acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples who have taken care of this land for time immemorial. I would also like this opportunity to introduce to you this image on the screen. This is a painting by Indigenous artist Shelley Nero. Shelley Nero is a Mohawk and a member of the Six Nation Reserve. In this particular painting, and in many of her paintings, Shelley Nero emphasized matriarchal heritage and power. In this particular painting that she named Weapon, what you see is a hand holding a needle, and on that needle, if you look carefully, you see a tiny little bead. For Shelley Nero, this persistent enactment of the traditional practice of beadwork symbolizes a force for social change. In this particular image, the desire for change is in relationship to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But my hope for the session today is to begin to consider how our work as early childhood educators is in so many ways perhaps similar to this beadwork, and to acknowledge that the work that we do that is sometimes slow and painstaking does contribute to social change. That brings me to the next slide, where I want to talk a little bit about the ethos of the series. One of the things that we want very intentionally to do is to center the work of early childhood educators in their daily practice. And I think this is something that is going to become very visible in the session today. Another intention that we had for this series is to kind of perhaps start changing our perception about sustainability. So it's common in the media and other places to think about sustainability as some kind of a future goal with a set of measurable outcomes. And I'm not suggesting that these goals are not important, but I do think that if we only think about sustainability through these outcomes, then we're missing the kinds of practices that are part of our daily work with children, our daily lives with children, and the possibilities for doing sustainable work that is often missed. So we very deliberately changed the word sustainability, which is a noun, to thinking about what is sustainable, what can we make possible when we do these very careful practices with young children. And as we were planning with a group of amazing educators that you will meet in a minute, as we were planning this session, something that we started noticing is not only that the educators are doing work that is intentionally towards a sustainable future and world, but also that they were able to cultivate certain kinds of structures, support, resource that makes that work that is sometimes radical, sustainable. So I invite you in the session today and in the following sessions to also notice what sustains sustainable pedagogies. And I do want to extend my gratitude for the educators. And when I say educators, I also include the pedagogical leaders that you will meet shortly for taking up the invitation and leading us today. And with that, I'm going to pass the screen to my dear colleague, Nancy Van Grol, who will speak about the structure of the session today.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to see so many faces this early on a Saturday morning, and I'm really excited to think and do with all of you. So as Iris has started speaking to a little bit, the session will have two parts. The beginning will be sharing stories. Educators and pedagogical leaders from UBC Childcare will be sharing with you some moments, ideas, values, orientations from their practice, and we will be immersed into these practices and ideas that are sustainable and do sustainable, have sustainable effects within the communities that they're in. We will have, that will be followed by a brief question and answer period. And then we'll move into an invitation that has been really carefully composed in response to the work that's been happening behind the scenes the past few months by Dr. Alex Berry, who is a faculty at the University of Calgary. So each kind of section will be an hour, and there will be both moments to listen to the stories, to respond in a question and answer period, and then engage in a directed or an invited practice that Alex has prepared for us. As a note, just a few logistics before we begin. There are images throughout this presentation, throughout this workshop that have children, and we ask that you do not take any photos of the screens for confidentiality purposes. We also are thinking really generatively, hopefully with the Ediths group, which is a feminist collective in Australia, who have also been having some online workshops, and they invite the chat as a vehicle for supporting ideas, for attending to moments or ideas that glow, to use the term by Maggie McClure. So please feel free in the chat to not only ask questions, but also add responses, add your feelings, your thoughts, ideas. We really see the chat as a generative space in this Zoom kind of abyss of connection. So please do so as we speak. I'm now going to hand my baton over to Melanie Walters, who is the first speaker from UBC Childcare Services, and I have the pleasure of introducing Melanie. Melanie has been an educator for over 25 years at UBC Childcare and completed a Master of Arts degree in Early Childhood Education from UBC in 2020. Her MA thesis, Reconsidering Risky Play in a Canadian Early Childhood Context, involved research that emerged over several years through her pedagogical approach, practice, and narrations with children and others. In her current role as program manager, Melanie oversees a portfolio of 8 childcare settings. This role entails administrative responsibilities, mentorship, and pedagogical collaborations with educators and children. These collaborations cultivate curiosity and deep thinking with materials, places, and ideas, which generate complex pedagogical projects. It is this part of work that that especially inspires her responsiveness to a vast range of pedagogical possibilities. So I welcome Melanie.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm so pleased and honored to be here today. So now I would like to introduce Anna Point, the Indigenous Relations and Engagement Pedagogist for UBC Childcare. Anna has been leading us through the decolonizing of our systems, thinking, and practices. Anna weaves Musqueam values and perspectives into UBC Childcare's commitment to pedagogy through strong reciprocal collaborations with Musqueam. As a first-generation Filipina Canadian, Anna has lived in the Musqueam community for over 20 years with her late husband, Terry Point, and their 3 children. Next, I'll introduce Rachel Lanphier, a senior early childhood educator of an infant-toddler setting at UBC Childcare. She's currently on maternity leave with her first child, who is now 8 months old. Rachel's philosophy and values include outdoor place-based education and supporting children's respectful and reciprocal relationships with others. In 2023, Rachel completed her Master of Education at UBC, learning from alternative narratives such as a common worlds framework and Indigenous perspectives and ways of being. Rachel believes that learning occurs in the context of place, and in the stories that are shared today, this particular place being the ancestral land of the Musqueam people. We will soon hear more from Anna about her pedagogical intentions and role in practice. And then we'll hear from Rachel about her praxis and how these roles and practices are intertwined. First, I'll share a few grounding ideas from UBC Childcare. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. At UBC Childcare, our orienting values include care and education, social and ecological justice, responsibility, and respect. And we'll go to the next slide. Our purpose involves centering and advocating for sustainable relationships in daily practice with young children. We emphasize place as a leading idea. Many of our childcare settings are located in or near the Pacific Spirit Park Forest that is situated on the unceded lands of the Homusqueam people. And our values, ethics, and pedagogy are deeply influenced by this place. Our values and ethics lead our pedagogical commitments. Together, we think with issues of social and ecological justice, including democracy, sustainability, decolonization, indigenization, and mutual respect. We engage with feminist ethics of care that lead to caring for and about others, including living others, human and non-human, and non-living others. We educate for and about Indigenous presence and knowledges, responsibility and responsibility, common world knowledges, sustainability, democracy, and place. These pedagogical commitments influence our pedagogy and inform the curriculum. I'll now pass it over to Anna to share her pedagogical intentions and more.
Asiem na siaya antha ena point na startlistach manathaltin tania humathwiam tla tana UBC childcare. Amit ia tana humathwiam ath tamuch tashwa amit tasahan kaminam kan haisepka. Hello everyone. What I said was, gosh, it's early in the morning. Okay, what I said was, hello, respected people. My name is Anna Point. My husband's ancestral name is Manathalton. His English name is Terry Point, and he is of Musqueam. UBC Childcare sits on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Hunkaminam speaking Homathweem people. Thank you. So I kind of wanted to start off with why is a land acknowledgement important, and what does that have to do with sustainability? And for me, the first thing to acknowledge is we can't sustain what we don't acknowledge. And the second thing is Musqueam is considered a warrior/protector society. And when people came to the shores from wherever they may be, since Musqueam is the first line of defense between ocean goers coming into the river, they needed to figure out who was friend or foe. And so these land acknowledgements, usually coming from the shore, people on their canoes, they came with a sense of humbleness, and they came with a sense of humility, where they said, I am so and so, I come from this nation, we're just asking for safe passage through to go to my cousin's wedding in Katesy territory, for example. So by a series of dialogue, Musqueam was able to allow this person or this company of people to come over and say, like, sure, go ahead. But if they came with a different intention, there was a lot of battles that happened on the shores. And so these land acknowledgements, when taken into the context of Musqueam, right here, it's so important to understand that this isn't a platform to elevate yourself when you use these land acknowledgements or say these land acknowledgements. It's supposed to come from a place of humbleness and humility to say, I know I'm a guest. I know that this is your land, and I'm going to really work hard to understand what that truly means, not just say the words. And that's the intention that Musqueam, for example, is going to understand. That's what they're going to hear. So, the third thing in that is I encourage you to examine how you do a land acknowledgement currently. Is it accurate to whose land you're standing on? And, it's everyone's responsibility to speak the truth that is written on the land, not just one person's truth, but a collective truth, whatever that may be. Okay. And if you guys have questions, I'm sure you can put them in the chats, and if you have a good thing, you don't want to forget it, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, so I have 4 intentions going forward. I'm in a really unique position where I'm surrounded by the Snowiath, these SNU teachings, and I have to think about taking care of my community, my Musqueam community, while also bridging safe conversations and spaces to teach and learn about Musqueam protocols and weave that into our childcare. So the first thing I wanted to say is I am a bit of a rebel, so I have to disrupt the moment to bend time. I used to say stop time, but that's kind of unrealistic. So I like the visual of bending time, where you're kind of slowing things down so that the past and the present can kind of coalesce. Slowing down to make space for traditional knowledges of the land, and ways to weave gratitude praxis in the moment. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So bending time and slowing it down. I always talk about finding the right timing. As you all know, as educators, as early childhood educators, you kind of have to pick your window of time to talk with kids. You're not going to pick the time when they're all bouncing off the walls and they can't sit still or they can't stand still. You're going to pick the moments where we're in a different slide. Oh, there we go. Never mind. Where they're in a space to hear. And when we're slowing down, I slow everything down, from walking slowly to speaking slowly to even nibbling little berries along the path slowly. And when we weave those gratitude moments and slowing down, there's wonderful moments that kind of come out of that. Their dialogue is richer. Their awareness of what's around them is just that much more heightened. And then also nourishing future abundance by learning reciprocal interconnected practices for all living things on the land. And for me, a big part of that is ethical harvesting and foraging. And it's important to the longevity of the plant that you're working with, for example, and asking yourself who else relies on this plant. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so interconnected practices. What do reciprocal interconnected practices make possible for all living things? I think that's a really great question just to keep with you at all times. For example, if you had a sister and she had children, would you take all the food out of her house just because you were hungry? What if that bush with berries was your sister? And how might those practices change when you follow a worldview where you are related to all living things? So in Musqueam, for example, if the worldview and the worldview is that you are interconnected with all living things living on the land, are you, how does that inform your practice in relationship to the land? It's actually quite different, isn't it? If you look at this picture, and I can give you a couple minutes to look at this picture on the slide, what do you see in this photo? And how will that inform your approach? And you guys can just jot a few things that you see in this photo, and then I'll talk about what I see. And don't worry, I won't play Jeopardy music or anything like that. Oh, I love you. You're throwing it into the chats too. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay, you guys are good at this. Well, you don't even need me. It's fine. Okay, so I see a few things. Thank you guys so much. And you can feel free to keep adding to the chat. I love it. So I see 1 ripe berry and 3 unripe berries. I see many berries that already have been plucked. And so usually when we're out on these forest walks, I will have a little like scissors or shears that I take with me, and I cut those spent ones off just so that the energy into the plant can go back into the plant and not into those spent spots. I see many leaves eaten by insects. So that means that in that area in particular, those insects or whatever they may be are relying on that spot as their feeding ground. So I want to be really careful about what I'm doing there. I see the 3 leaves on 1 vine. So I know those are vining blackcap bush berries. And so I make sure that I don't want to do anything that hurts any other living thing around and give them less of a chance for survival. So I can see one child here is ready to pick this red one. And I probably had said something like, oh, I wonder if that one's ready. And so a lot of times I will talk about, and I'll say it a bit more in the next slide or the slide after, where I talk about if things are not ready, it's not meant for you. And if you cannot reach that berry, it was never meant for you. And that can be a little difficult for children to understand, especially when they're so ready to just pick all the berries off the bush. I know you guys know what I'm talking about. Having them to asking them to slow down and really think about other things around them can be really difficult. So having it sort of a constant conversation as you're on these walks are so important. Okay, can I get the next slide? Okay, I did some math. Okay, so within the context of this land, the Musqueam people have been here for approximately 13,000 years. The city of Vancouver officially began in April 1886, and it will be 139 years old in April. If one generation is approximately 25 years, then that's only about 5.5 generations. Many Indigenous nations believe in being accountable for the next 7 generations, and that belief informs how they live in relationship with the land. What has changed in the last 138 years when settlers have occupied the land? Looking at the people of Vancouver, what do you think informs the people about Vancouver, about how they live with the land? And what is Vancouver's worldview? How has Vancouver contributed to the land in the last 5 generations? And can it make it to 7 generations? Feel free to jot these questions down and really think about them, because um, it's so important to really just ask yourself to reflect on, because can we as a people continue at the speed and with the veracity of which we've consumed this world? I'll leave that up to you guys. I'll leave that up to your reflections. You know, living in Musqueam, we see it from a perspective of weathering a storm, of being able to safeguard us for the next 7 generations. So that might mean that we sacrifice a little more in this generation to make sure that the next 7 generations have something. What are we as ECE educators going to do to ensure the next 7 generations? Okay, can I get the next slide? I'm flipping pages. Woo-hoo. Okay. So forest walks, giving something back. I don't have a destination in mind, which kind of goes sometimes against our ECE brains, where we kind of have to have a plan. And I use key phrases that model accountable reciprocity. So for example, I'll say things like, let's see what we can see. So I don't have a plan in place. Let's see what we can see. How many hands do you have? Then you only ever need to take 2 berries from the bush, which seems a little, well, so some children take to it really well. They make sense to them. 2 hands, 2 berries. But sometimes you have kids that just want all the berries off the bush. And so then I say something like, there's always another bush down the way. And this is something that I try to build in with our walks so that children understand that there is abundancy as long as we take care of things now. As long as we're accountable for things, there should be abundancy down the way. And then, as I said before, I might say something like, if you cannot reach it, then it was never meant for you. And I know as ECEers, we've kind of done that thing where, you know, a kid wants a berry, they can't reach it, we bend the branch, or we bend, you know, we do something to help get them those berries. But what I kind of challenge you is to have this built-in form of abundance for all living things. So not just for the child who wants the berries that are way up high, that are probably even more juicier, but also thinking about the birds and the insects and the other little animals that are around, and making sure that they have something as well. So I talk about, you know, bending time and making space and sharing resources with all living things, like I said. I show ways to give gratitude and respect. So for example, I bring water, and I ask the children to, with the educators, I'll say, make sure they bring their water bottles, so that if we do take something from the berry or from wherever, or from the bush, wherever it may be, that we're also giving it some water. And how I relay that to the children is, we don't know the next time they're going to have a drink or a meal. So by giving them water and giving them thanks, we're just thanking them for what they've produced. I teach how to say the native plants in Hunkaminam, the language of the land, and how to identify them. So for example, one of my favorite berries in the bush is, it's thimbleberry. And the Hunkaminam word for that is tquam. And you can tell it's a thimbleberry plant because I love the feeling of they look like maple leaves, but they're kind of fuzzy like velvet. And for me, the berry is yummy because it's a cross between a raspberry and like a jammy date. Like it has a really cool taste to it. And so when we're talking about this and we're going on walks, the children are actually paying attention to the next bush along the way. So if they want that salmonberry, if they want that tquam or the thimbleberry, then they're going to keep their eyes out when we're walking to find that next bush to try to get those next 2 berries. But that's building it into our walks, and it's building it into our pedagogy. So yeah, these are just a few ways to give back to the land, which is responsible for all living things on the land. And I thank you for your time. I think next up is Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you this morning and to see so many familiar faces and colleagues that I've worked with. I first began working at UBC as an educator about 9 years ago. And when I first started going outside of the center and outside of the outdoor play space on walks with children, I felt like we needed to have it all planned out. We needed to have a predetermined destination in mind. I went through all of these questions that I have listed here. Where was our destination going to be? How much time did we have before we needed to return to the center? How far would we go? Where would we go? And what would we see and experience when we were out? And about 5 years ago, few key things began happening to start shifting my practice as an educator. The COVID-19 pandemic changed the way we cared for children, and we wanted to keep everyone safe, and our policies changed. And suddenly we were spending all day outside except for napping and toileting and diapering. And because of this, we began going on daily walks with the children in small groups, and we had primary caregiving groups. And so partly we went outside of the center so that we could maintain distance from each other, even in the outdoor play yard. But we also felt like we had more freedom and time to do so and to be out of our space of the childcare environment. We also began learning from other perspectives and ways of being in the world. Around this time, I read Braiding Sweetgrass for the first time by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And this book really changed my mindset and really opened my eyes to the different perspectives and the ways of being, especially being outside. And then the idea that the world has agency and we are in a reciprocal relationship with all of these other beings. My role at UBC also shifted, and I started working more closely with Melanie as my program manager and as the senior educator at Child Care Center at UBC. And along the same time, Anna also joined or came back to UBC and started her role as the Indigenous Relations and Engagement Pedagogist. And with their guidance, helping me challenge my views as an educator and also asking questions. And a lot of the stories that I'm going to share came from the walks and the talks that I had with Melanie and Anna and the children in my center, and also my team members. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I began shifting my mindset, as I said, and then rather than needing to have a destination in mind or a goal of where we were going to go, I started beginning to let the children lead, and we could pause and explore and follow these paths like the one pictured here, sometimes not necessarily going anywhere, but rather meandering. And Kimmerer states in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, the land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. And that's a quote that I keep with me and I keep returning back to over and over. All right, next slide. So this idea of meandering, through this shift in my practice, I began intentionally slowing down and following the children's lead. I would let them decide what direction we were going, or we would pause and just sit. And sometimes that meant sitting in a field and watching the birds fly overhead, or watch an excavator pick up leaves around us. I needed to purposely let go of a preconceived plan or learning or experience that would take place. And as Anna said, as educators, sometimes that's really hard to do because in our training as ECEs, we are taught to plan these experiences for children to engage with. And I really needed to let that go. There's also the idea or the concept of time that was always on my mind. We often feel like we need to have a set schedule or an order of our routines, and that these things need to occur in a childcare environment inside. But now that we were outside for most of the day, it really challenged a lot of these ideas for me. We were eating outside anyway at our childcare center because of our COVID-19 policies. And so why did we need to rush back to the center or return back to do those things? I began having conversations with my team, and we all talked about together, why did the walk need to just be a short activity in our day? Why couldn't we stay out and just be outside? Uh, what was the barriers to this? We began bringing a wagon for children so that if they became tired on these walks, they could sit in the wagon and ride in the wagon instead. Being with infants and toddlers, we also had children who were under a year old. And so sometimes we would bring baby carriers to wear the really young children on our bodies as we walked. And we would sit and rest, and there didn't feel that pressure to return. If we had 4 children, which is the ratio for infants and toddlers, there was no need for us all to be back at the center if other children needed to sleep at certain times or other children did want to eat at the center. We began bringing our snacks or our lunches and water bottles with us so that we could eat while we were on our walks. And it felt like we were opening up more possibilities because of this. And the more we were outside, we began visiting and revisiting certain special places, and we became more familiar with all of these places. And this led us to a deeper understanding and connection with the land and the natural world all around us. So we really began letting the land lead us and letting go that agency and that power that we as humans have, and also creating those more authentic relationships with the world and with the rocks that we encountered and the puddles and the ground beneath us and the animals and so much more. And for those of you who either work at UBC or who have spent a lot of time at UBC, you might recognize these places that are pictured here. If you haven't, you might not know these places, but to us, they are and were very special. And we visited them weekly, if not daily. And the children know these places by name. They're names that the children created or educators in the past have created. And sometimes they're known by different names if you ask a different person. So there's the dinosaur rocks, which is the top image of the rocks laid out in a circle. There's the fire truck graveyard on the bottom, which are old abandoned fire trucks that are sitting tucked in behind the fire station at UBC. We also visited the bird's nest, and at the fire station, there was also the Echo Place, which is an industrial tunnel where the children knew they could shout into this space and they would hear their voices echo back to them. And we knew that there was a large puddle that often formed in this space. And there was also a patch of indigenous and invasive blackberry bushes that were across the field from our center, or a place that we could go where there were composting leaves that were deposited, and we would sometimes see an excavator moving them back and forth. And many of these places may not seem special, but to us and the children, we created relationships with these places and with the beings that were in these places. Next slide. There we go. And if any of you have read the chapter that we all collaborated on, we mentioned the concept of desire paths. And the images here show the same path that we revisited over and over. And this is a path that we traveled daily. It was connecting our center with the main office at UBC and other surrounding childcare centers. And every time we visited, there was new encounters or new possibilities. You can see here, one day there were many rocks scattered that the children wanted to sit and examine and look over. There were also one day tire tracks that created rivets and ruts that the children stepped into and on top of. And there was also a large puddle that often formed when it rained. Next slide. So what does it look like when we are truly present? And you can see here, this is a photo of Enna with a child on a walk that we took together. And I want to go back to that idea of time and slowing down and being intentional, as Enna had talked about earlier. Those are all things that began shifting in my practice as well with the support of both Anna and Melanie. And what does it look like when we can open ourselves up to these possibilities and relationships with the plants or with the ground or with the trees and the animals? And these experiences really can't be planned. Next slide. On our walks with Enna, we learned about how to ask the plants for permission before picking it, as Enna said. And there's a way she taught us that you can feel if it wants to be picked or if it's already chosen another path. And so those are things that we invited the children to experience too. We weren't just telling them, they were experiencing firsthand when we were out on these walks. She helped us remember and reminded us to give thanks to the berry bushes when we did pick one to eat, and we offered them water, as you saw in the image before. And thinking about the idea of only taking a few berries and leaving them for other beings who needed them, other birds or animals, or even other people who might stumble past. And we really tried to be in relationship with these plants. The children, as you can see on the far right-hand side, they learned how to identify cedar trees around us. And we would say hello to them as we walked past. And you can see in this image, the child is putting his hand on the cedar tree. And we invited them to have these close connections with the plants and the trees, much like you might with another person. We treated them in that way. And in the far left-hand picture with the vibrant green leaf, we learned about the frog leaf plant and that it has medicinal qualities, and it taught us that. And later on, this could have been even weeks later, this particular child found this plant growing in our outdoor play yard and placed it on their arm and remember that it had healing properties. And so this is an image that I captured. It wasn't something that I directed this child to do, but it was something they remembered from this walk. Next slide. I also want to touch on that these places do all have a colonial history and implications. And even though many of the images that you've seen may seem very idyllic, they weren't always places that were serene spaces or in the forest. And I know often educators may say, well, I don't have a forest near my childcare center. How do I do this in my own practice? And we often spent time in places that really were not places that you would meant to spend time in. Sometimes they were by parking lots with chain link fences surrounding them, or by the edge of a sidewalk where you can see the children decided to sit and examine something they found on the ground. All of these spaces also were at one time forested areas, and the trees were cut down for buildings. And some of these buildings were then later demolished and not rebuilt. And so these areas were left as open fields where things began to grow again. And it really was challenged to move past the idea that you can only have relationships or experiences outside in what we would consider beautiful natural spaces. And instead, how can we have connections and conversations? The middle picture shows a fallen tree. So with the children wondering why the tree has fallen down in this forested area and has died. And one child's theory was that an excavator had come. And these conversations all led to deeper thinking and understanding and relationships. And I will pass it, I think, back to Melanie.
Thank you, Rachel and Anna, for those glimpses and really meaningful moments that you've both shared with all of us. So for parting thoughts, it's not a conclusion. These are just ideas to continue to think with. Our values, purpose, and pedagogical commitments generate praxis possibilities. So that what we're suggesting here is just to think about these ideas as how these may continue to resonate and become more possibilities in practice. The interconnected relationships of reciprocity also influence praxis. Sustainable pedagogies are first about understanding and connecting with the land where you stand. Indigenous knowledges have sustained the land for millennia. Bending time, revisiting ideas and place, and attending to presence can de-romanticize nature while supporting sustainable pedagogies. And if we could go to the next slide. Thanks. So a few ideas and questions to think with. When educators experience a perspective shift, like what Rachel has shared, new pedagogical intentions may emerge. How might a commitment to reciprocity unfold? What does that look like in practice? And what practices can we engage with to support the next 7 generations? I'll just end there, and thank you everyone for being present and thinking about these ideas with us in this virtual space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie, Rachel, and Anna. And I'm going to put Deb Thompson on the spot as well because of her immense support in bringing us to today and supporting this presentation. So I know you're out there, Deb, and thank you to you as well. My heart is very full. I can kind of feel tears wanting to burst out. And I'm also had to look outside because it started snowing a few minutes ago. And it just kind of brought it all together. So very generously, Melanie, Rachel, and Anna have agreed to have a conversation with us. And this is an opportunity for you to make some comments, ask questions. And we have over 100 people here today. I'm not quite sure how to manage this opportunity for a discussion, which reminds me that I didn't mention that we have Nora Perry here from the Edith Landau Virtual Center, who's here to support us. And I wanted to thank you, Nora, for being here and monitoring the chat, as well as helping us with all the tech aspects of the Zoom. So I do want to open it up to questions and comments, and we'll just figure it out as we go. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's great, because I don't think if you put up your hand, like the Zoom hand, I don't know if I'll be able to see it because the screen is not enough to hold everybody's images here.
The hand function should work because it'll just bring them to the top.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. So either a hand or unmute yourself or put your question in the chat. Loretta, it looks like you're putting your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I was listening to all those instructions and I'm like, oh, which one do I do first? I think for me, just listening to these voices, it just reminds me that of this shift. The children often teach us to be in the moment and to just really value that. I had the privilege of being beside the Alouette River when I had a preschool and going there often and seeing when the fish ran and when they didn't run and I always thought that was beautiful, but I thought, oh, am I the pressure sometimes from parents, are my children going to be ready for the world? And I think that it's just a good, strong reminder that what is this world we want to live in the future worlds, and standing there and watching, they would call them sharks because they would, the sharp teeth of the salmon. And I'd be cautious that they would fall in because they were so intent. But I love this remembering what is just around us. And from that place, if they know our place deeply and personally, that this now shifts that thinking that all places have personal connection to someone. And I love this idea of slowing down. been a passion of mine as well, and I'm so encouraged with your voices, and that I could be a part of this going forward.
Oh, thank you so much, Loretta. And if Melanie, Rachel, or Anna would like to respond, you're absolutely welcome to do that.
Well, I can respond. I just thank you for sharing that about being close to the river, and thinking about the place where you are at and how you connect to it. It makes me think back to my own practice as an educator, and how much just being out in the space where we were situated became the curriculum. That was what we engaged with on a daily basis. And it wasn't about doing, of course, there's always activities and things like that that happen in early childhood spaces, but the really meaningful parts of our day where we were connected as a group happened when we were out and about, whether it was in the yard or outside of the yard, but just being present and slowing down time. That was really, really pivotal. So I think that really resonates with everything that Rachel and Anna have shared as well.
Thank you, Melanie.
I can add to that as well, Iris, if you want.
Sure.
And I think someone also asked about like, how do you let go in the chat? Like, how do you really let yourself be present and just stay in that moment? And it is really challenging. And I think it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that you have to continuously push yourself to do, I think, to remind yourself when you're in it, like, oh, I don't need to be teaching the children about something. I don't need to be directing them to see certain things. Like, how can I really step back and not take the lead, but be there and be very present in the moment with them and let them decide? But also, like I said in the presentation, like, what will we experience? What will the land show us? What will the plants show us? It's not just a human-centric or child-centric philosophy either. And I think just pushing yourself to go out and do it. And there's no right or wrong way. And I think sometimes my hesitancy or my nervousness to go outside of the childcare center is the idea of safety. How do you keep children safe on a walk? How do you manage a group of children? And I think that also, just like I said, the more you do it, it almost felt like for me after a while of going outside, like once we were outside, I could like take a deep breath and be like, okay, like we're outside, like we're outside of the center. It almost felt easier sometimes after getting over that first hurdle, just feeling like there was less. Sometimes I feel like when you're in those four walls or you're in a fenced in space, sometimes you can see more of those challenging interactions between children, and you feel a bit closed in. But being out, you can really focus on the children in front of you, on your small group. I don't know if that answered anything, but just some thoughts to add.
Thank you, Rachel. And I am going back to that notion of creating the sustainable context so that you would feel that you could take those risks and shift your practices. And you know, I would encourage you to think within your context: who are your teachers, who are your resources, who supports your work. And I was just going to add, Rachel, to what you said in terms of teachings, because in Anna's presentation, I actually did see a lot of teachings. And sometimes it is having the courage to, I think, align yourself with certain kinds of teachings, which I think, the way that I know UBC childcare, you've worked really hard to align yourself with particular kinds of teachings that you continuously go back to and consider and reconsider.
About children wanting to go back or potentially needing to use the washroom. So we never went far. Like I said, I was with infants and toddlers, and so the concept of distance is relative in that sense. We were on foot most of the time, but there was never, I didn't feel like that was necessarily a barrier. If something happened where a child did need a diaper changed, sometimes I would change it in a private area outside where I could, make sure the space was safe and change it there, or we would just go back to the center, change a child's diaper, and then go out again. Or there are community UBC with washrooms, so I would bring the children into a community space that had a public washroom. So there were options available. I'm not saying everyone has those options when out on a walk, but it's really about looking at what your context is and seeing that there's different possibilities.
And I think that
Uh,
oh, sorry, I was just
sorry.
gonna say, I think that speaks as well to thinking about sustainable relationships and practices, like from a community place, right? Like between colleagues, between mentors, managers, right? Like how all of these relationships come together to uphold those commitments and values that Melanie so beautifully shared about. If those are your overarching commitments, then that means everybody is working with them and doing so in different ways. I'm sure Melanie or someone else can speak more to this, but that is, it's held collectively, and in those moments where it's a bit more tensioned, or there's like a moment that is like a conflict like that, that you would have time to think that through, or there would be an openness to think that problem through together, or that tension or that knot.
Thank you, Nancy.
I'd just like to add just something really briefly, because I know we probably have to move on to the second part right away. But just thinking about that, like there's been some ideas here of like resisting the busyness, or having to get back and go on breaks and all of those things. And what Rachel has described of being out and being able to do many of the things that you might think you need to do at the center. But when this becomes a regular practice, it's like a way of connecting that becomes like a ritual almost, in that then the children who are involved, the educators who are involved, returning to those places is special, and that does reduce some of those difficult moments. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but the way of being shifts. And as like having Anna join on a walk and learning about the plants and the berries and the land is so meaningful for the children that they want to go and revisit those places. And then the focus is more shifted to how they're experiencing what is around them, and being in that place, in that puddle, in those bushes next to that fence. That's what is then happening. So I just wanted to leave off on that idea of, again, returning to that sitting with, bending time, and being there, being present.
Mm-hmm. There are other questions in the chat, but Melanie's right. We do have to thinking against exactly what we're talking about slowing down. We only have 2 hours together here. But I do want to mention a good part of this is that this is not the last session where educators from UBC Childcare will be joining us. So there will be more time in future sessions where we can keep these questions that are in the chat and bring it back to the team that's organizing, and we'll use that to inform where we go next, and there will be more opportunities if you continue to sign up to join us at these gatherings.
I was just going to say something very similar. So
Oh,
thank
great.
you, Nancy. Yeah, we do want to acknowledge that we respect every question and every comment. So we will find a way to somehow sustain ways to, or find ways to respond to them. Okay, Nancy, all yours.
So we're going to switch to the second part of today. This will be, we're playing with time here a little bit, and we're playing with the digital space also. Alex Berry, who I mentioned at the very beginning, she's unfortunately not able to join us synchronously or in the same time right now, but she has recorded herself with an invitation to invite you to kind of work through these ideas, actually do, make, think, move through some of the ideas that you have been hearing about so far in this session. She wishes she will be here in future sessions, but this, I think, is kind of a playful way to think about the digital world and how we come together in this space anyways. So Alex engages, just as a mode of introduction, she engages with the arts and research creation towards anti-colonial pedagogies that respond to times of ecological crises. She's interested in feminist post-qualitative methodologies for experimenting with the complexities of 21st century childhoods and for creating pedagogies alongside educators that answer to social and climate injustice. And Alex has been working closely with us as well. She's been a part of our conversations and reading the chapter that we keep mentioning as well, that Melanie and Anna and Rachel and Deb and Karen wrote together. I'm going to share my screen and bring Alex into this space, and we will have a slight pause in the middle of the recording. At the end of the recording, she was going to ask, she's going to invite you to do something in your own spaces, and then we'll come back together as a group to have a discussion about it. So I'm going to share and bring Alex in right now. Can everyone see my screen? Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you all today from a distance and across time. I'm very grateful for this invitation from Iris and Nancy to be with you all here. And I'm also very grateful for the work that Rachel, Anna, Deb, and Melanie have invited us all to think with as they walk with children on Musqueam lands. And I want to share my appreciation for the walking stories that they've shared with you all today. And with them, I'm
Hi, Nancy, you need to unmute yourself.
That engage early childhood in the complexity of place in the midst of contradictions, inconsistencies, and difficulties. And in the context of this virtual workshop and the Doing Sustainable Pedagogies online series, how we might begin to tell stories that weave us in place with weather and children, technologies, and these digital threads of sticky connection that hold us here today. And so a question that I've been thinking about in my own work lately is, how do we do virtual place pedagogies in ways that are grounded and embedded? As Anna asks of us in her writing and thinking with the late Terry Point, who I recently learned is her late husband, how do we do this work, however imperfectly, with our feet touching the ground? I am joining you from Treaty 7 territory in Mohkinstsis, which is where the Elbow River and the Bow River meet. It is a place of juncture and exchange and movement. Mohkinstsis is the original name of this place given by the Blackfoot peoples. And then it was then renamed by Scottish settlers as Calgary. And so Treaty 7 is made of the lands of the Blackfoot, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda peoples. And it's also the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta, districts 5 and 6, who also call this place Otusquonie, which means elbow. And so as we gather across multiple and distinct settler colonial contexts, I want to begin by intentionally hesitating to constructions of the virtual as a neutral or immaterial place, one that is occupied by Donna Haraway's Nowhere Man, one who sees but cannot be seen, and as she says, with a gaze from nowhere. As Rachel, Anna, Deb, and Melanie describe so generously in their work, our collaborations are so deeply contingent upon and activated by the local places from which we join, even our digital collaborations. Yet at the same time, this locality is entangled with elsewhere places, unseen labor, and livelihoods. And so here I'll bring in a companion to think with, visual artist and geographer Trevor Paglin, as he proposes that learning to see and walk with the world through technosensory systems demands attention to how our wires of connection, which may seem virtual or elusive, are so undeniably material. The batteries in my laptop and a salt flat lithium brine in Argentina, my motherboard of copper and Canada's open pit mines in Ecuador, a conversation with ChatGPT and 2 glasses of water. And then, of course, the 1.5 million kilometers of fiber optic cables making waves under the ocean floor. These are flows of virtual connection produced by very material infrastructures. And so I've brought an image beside me to share with you. This is a photo by Trevor Paglin of fiber optic cables underneath the Atlantic Ocean. So participating in this collective virtual space requires attention to how we assemble and are assembled by the digital forms through which we connect, and how our presence and our engagements in these spaces co-situate us with others, other people, other places, weather, plants, animals. And I'm thinking with Claire Blackwell and colleagues in their study of co-situation in location-aware gay dating apps to start thinking about this online gathering as a space of co-presence that complicates questions about locality and where one is. And so I'm wondering if listening to co-presence might help us in entering into this virtual online series in a way that takes seriously, in Blackwell's words, that our online interactions are deeply entwined with offline places and relationships. And with inspiration from Anna and her collaborations with educators at UBC Childcare Services, how we might engage in these online spaces in ways that foreground reciprocity. As digital platforms such as Zoom and my recording device generate this sense of cybernetic proximity to places that may be perceived as distant, I think there's something really curious about this proximity and simultaneous distance, and how it connects us across places. And I'm wondering if it might help us to pay attention to how what happens distinctly in one place matters to another. What does this proliferation of places produced very uniquely by an online workshop do to our differential obligations as people within and across very specific places? When viewed through the lens of co-presence, the digital calls for this complicated and expanded sense of obligation that kind of goes beyond my own backyard. And it also disrupts the purity of an intact outdoor space that we walk through with children, that the educators at UBC have so importantly gestured to. In other words, perhaps the digital quality of this workshop offers us something that could be important as we take up Rachel, Anna, Deb, and Melanie's invitation to slow down, to listen, and to attempt to learn with a place.
Just going to pause it here for a second before Alex transitions into the invitation that she's going to share with us. Just to kind of feel and sense what Alex is sharing with us. I'm just going to pause for a second and we can actually just sit and pause together, I think, to kind of, there's a lot that's being shared and maybe we can feel and sense what she's saying. And feel free to add ideas in the chat or noticings.
Hi, Nancy. Friday has a question in the chat that says, how to engage in spaces that foreground reciprocity? And then Linda Fong also asks, can you explain a little bit more about foregrounds reciprocity is?
We can try. Those are beautiful questions. And I think really hard and difficult questions to think about in online spaces. And maybe that's actually, instead of us answering it right now, we can put it back to the audience after you engage with the invitation. Like, where did you see reciprocity today? What were the moments that you felt an exchange, a giving, a receiving throughout? Was it possible in this space? Can we make it possible in these kinds of spaces? We're joining from all over in very different contexts and places. And are there ways that we can foreground that reciprocity, that exchange in vivid material, but also digital ways, I guess. Do you want to add anything to that, Iris, or should we keep going?
I think that Alex is really challenging all of us to think very carefully and intentionally about the possibilities of these virtual spaces. I even think that it's a really good question for the Edith Landau Virtual Learning Center. So I agree with you that the question that was posed in the chat is something for us to think about. And I haven't thought that deeply about the materiality of these virtual connections. So having the image of this on the grounds of the ocean, on the bottom of the ocean, having these cables that actually afford us this communication is definitely a very different way of thinking about these connections, and in so many ways connected to the topic of the series.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just leave it there.
I appreciate as well that Alex brings our attention to the material in, lithium batteries in our computers, that they aren't just these things that are out there immaterial, they are grounded, they are a part of the earth and of us. So it's an interesting and difficult kind of tension to occupy here. I'm going to keep going, and please continue to add ideas and responses in the chat.
Our conversation happens in times of intensifying weather, atmospheric rivers, floods, drought, heat, fire. And I'm wondering about how we might carefully and thoughtfully tune in to how, the atmospheric quality of weather and climate touches us all and touches us differently, and how we might think through walking and with weather through this non-neutral digital form that connects us today. And so I'm going to offer us an exercise, and it's an experiment in paying attention that some students from Capilano University and I have been trying out in some of our online classes. I'm currently writing about some of these experiments alongside Kezia Gibbons, Isabel Porter, and Greg Wilcox. And so they've been my companions in this thinking. And so I'd like to invite us into a feminist breathing inventory experiment. And I'll provide a little bit of context before I share the experiment with you all today. So the experiment, the idea of a breathing inventory, is inspired by Blanche Verley and Astrida Neymanis's concept practice of conspiratorial breathing. They propose that conspiration is an act of breathing together in ways that attune to embodied relations with connective atmospheres and common breathscapes. Importantly, conspiratorial breathing attunes to breathing as a shared but differentiated phenomenon that's lived through particular embodied social, political, historical, geographical airways. And so in this workshopping element of our time together, I'm hoping to invite us into this experiment with conspiratorial breathing as a form of feminist, more than human witnessing, where we can, as individual bodies, try to pay attention to our relationality and our porosity with and through breathscapes and atmospheres and what it is that we breathe with. So breathing as witnessing climate catastrophe and weather requires recognition that while we all breathe climate crisis, we breathe it differently. And this is an idea that I borrow from Blanche Verley and Astrida Neymanis. Breathing with settler colonial atmospherics brings attention to climate catastrophe as an uneven multi-species suffocation, where the fleshy intimacy and vitality of breathing is tangled up with multiple and interrelated systemic respiratory injustices. In the context of so-called British Columbia on Musqueam lands, breathing together means breathing with lasting resonances of local climate emergencies, such as atmospheric rivers and mudslides. Here in Treaty 7, it might mean breathing with jasper wildfire ash, as well as global respiratory crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the mass asphyxiation of Palestinian children, and the subsequent storm of infectious respiratory disease circulating in Gaza. Colonial respiratory violences implicate us differently in common atmospherics. And without minimizing this complexity, this breathing experiment will involve two interrelated elements that move us and struggle to situate breathing in common atmospherics. And so I'll share a little bit about the experiment now. Perhaps Nancy can also share with you the propositions in the chat. And so in the first element of the experiment, we'll take up, well, firstly, we'll leave Zoom and you can go outside, go for a walk, a short walk. And we'll try and settle somewhere on this walk and take up the seemingly simple task of breathing with the intention of slowing down and paying attention in the particular place that you're joining from. And so we'll breathe for some time. We will record the sound of our individual breath. And then if you're comfortable, you can post this recording in a Padlet link that Nancy will share with you. In the second element of the experiment, we'll create a breathing inventory of our breath. And I borrow this idea of a breathing inventory from Mr. Neymanis. So outside, we will sketch out, perhaps make a list or even diagram an inventory of what we might be breathing with, and importantly, who or what we're breathing with. So the instructions for the second part of the experiment are intended to try and move us beyond practices of mindful breathing or, introspective self-care, and to try and provoke us to pay attention to the specificity of air in a particular place as something that moves with and also beyond individual intentionality. And so some of the questions that are framing this breathing inventory are: who or what are you surrounded by? Who or what else is breathing here? Are there smells in the air? What do these smells indicate? How might what might be in this air that you and others are breathing? And how are human presences or structures present and informing the air? And so this final question of the breathing inventory experiment is intended to try and orient us to not only pay attention to perceived natural or pleasant atmospheric elements, that thick, cold smell of West Coast rain that is so fresh, or flowers in the garden. Those things matter too. But to try and also to think about, the colonial and capitalist presences that you might also be breathing with, such as pollutants like diesel exhaust, wildfire smoke, that figure differently across breathscapes. So we're trying to sort of register some of the complexity of the things that we're breathing and who we might be breathing with. In the final task of the breathing inventory experiment, you'll make a note of what is absent or what might be absent in the inventory. And so this is a deliberate invitation to try and attend to what escapes your knowledge and what moves beyond you. And so this absence is a really important quality of conspiratorial breathing and this breathing inventory experiment, and its inherent failures and impossibilities, of inventorying breath that this experiment kind of intensifies, and the tensions that it plays on. So that absence is a really important element. You can post processes, photos of your sketches, your note-taking, your lists, and your diagramming. And the processes of this feminist sort of contradictory take on cataloging and the breathing inventory in the Padlet. And then we'll share some of our processes and speak to what you noticed when you all come back together on Zoom. So this experiment, it attempts to create a space for breathing together that's situated in what Blanche Verley and Estrada Neymanes call these hyper-local instantiations, hyper-local moments, while entangling this very intimate and place-specific breathing and noticing with distant elsewhere places and these broader planetary relations that we're always already breathing with. And so I hope that you find the experiment generative as you slow down and pay attention to the place that you are in, and perhaps that listening through breathing might contribute in some way to walking a bit slower, and perhaps toward a sense of reciprocity that really deeply figures the active breathing in this inhale and exhale, this gaseous exchange. That breathing is never something that's done alone or in isolation. And perhaps breathing together in these digital atmospheres might help us in some way as we start to think about what it means to sustain and to be sustained by others in times of climate crises. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking up this experiment with me, and for thinking alongside us today. And I really look forward to hearing how you find it and what you noticed in the experiment. And so I will stay tuned and look forward to hearing from others about how it went. So I hope that you enjoy, and I wish you all the best in your breathing and your walking together. Thank you so much.
And I think we had an opportunity not only to think about sustainable pedagogies, but also about how virtual spaces can be a context for transformation, for engagement, for making new friends, encountering new ideas. So thank you for being here. We don't have the exact date for the next session. It will probably be towards the end of March, but keep your eyes open for the when the advertisement for the next session comes out, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend and hope to see you again.